FBI active shooter research pioneer Katherine Schweit on the potential for UnitedHealthcare CEO killer copycats. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America from a sober, serious perspective. This week on the show, we are talking about two killings that have made a lot of news recently and may be a bit more intertwined than they seem at first glance. To do that, we have back on the show a guest from a while back, but who I think will bring a very interesting perspective to this conversation. Katherine Schweit, who was an FBI agent that actually created and ran their active shooter investigation team there. So welcome back to the show, Katherine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks. I'd say I haven't seen you in a long time, but we were just downtown on a CNN panel together.
That's right. Yes. Talking about one of these two shootings. And it said, hey, we need to reconnect because there's more conversation to have about these two incidents. Yeah, absolutely. And just to give people a little more broad view of your background, can you just tell them, people, your history at the FBI and then what you're doing today?
Sure. I spent 20 years in the FBI as an agent. Before that, I was a prosecutor in Chicago. So I got a little bit of lawyer in me. Don't hold that against me. And because of that, I teach a class in the Second Amendment at DePaul University's College of Law. I've taught that course for a long time in Chicago. And I actually live in the DC area, but I just fly home, so to speak, to teach the class probably once a year, because I think the Second Amendment and the issue around guns is fascinating. And so
absolutely.
After 15 years in the FBI, the Sandy Hook shooting happened at the elementary school. And then I was plucked, from the corridor and said, okay, create a program, see what's wrong, find out what the protocols should be. And from that, I joined a White House team with other people from other agencies. There were just like 5 of us. And we concurred on Run, Hide, Fight as a messaging system for the country, to just the idea that it's quick, it's translatable, from a language standpoint. It's the basics about what physically everybody does when shootings occur. They run or hide or fight or some combination of that. And then we also, because I was the only law enforcement member on the team, our team pushed out the police protocols that now police uses. But at the time, we didn't have a consistent protocol for how police responded, and also how we handled victims and how we handle communications. And so we're a lot more consistent about when we arrive at the scene, who arrives, what they're doing. And so that was kind of boring policy sort of stuff that I worked on too. But I think it's made a difference. I see it just in the impact of just the latest shooting, that one of the shootings that we're going to talk about, a police chief got up. He had 4 press conferences in one day. He had a very, very steady script of what he needed to have. Ting, 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 ting. And that's great. That shows us that we've made a lot of changes for the better in the last few years in terms of communicating with the public and dealing with the public and, helping victims and survivors. So that's kind of stuff. Then I left the FBI because I was mandatory in 2017, mandatory age. They kick you out at a certain age. And so then I kind of started my own consulting business, but I spent more time writing a book called Stop the Killing, How to End the Mass Shooting Crisis, and starting a podcast by that name, Stop the Killing.
Yes, very good podcast.
But the gun stuff is just there. So I actually have a book specifically on how to talk about guns with anyone. It's basically a simple guide to the Second Amendment.
Yes. So you have spent a lot of time focused on this area that we're going to be talking about throughout your career here. And I think you have a lot of really interesting insight. And so let's get into these two shootings that we've seen, because they might not necessarily seem connected at first glance. But you had the murder of the UnitedHealthcare CEO, Brian Thompson, in New York City. And then you also had a school shooting at a Christian school in Wisconsin this week. And one of the interesting things about that school shooting, one of the concerning things that's been concerning for now 25 years, is that the shooter was enamored by and inspired by, it seems, from the reporting we have, the Columbine shooters. Columbine happened in 1999, and you still have school shooters today who will use a similar playbook. And you actually also saw a bit of a similar playbook in the UnitedHealthcare killing, because that shooter manifestos are kind of something that came about in large part because of Columbine. And so you even saw that in that shooting. But what interests me about the connection here is the reason why Columbine has stayed with us for so long. I've had Professor James Densley on the show, who's one of the co-authors of The Violence Project, where they researched this and they found Columbine was a very important touchstone, I guess, in this mass shooting era we've had in the last several decades. And one of the reasons was that those shooters wanted to be remembered for this. They wanted other people to follow their lead. They did a lot of messaging. And that's something we see has followed through all the way to this latest shooting in Wisconsin. And it's also something that seems to me this UnitedHealthcare CEO shooter is also trying to do. But he's doing it in a new way for a new media environment. I think he may be, sort of the first TikTok killer. He got a lot of notoriety for this killing, and he left a lot of messaging. He did a lot of things similar to how the Columbine shooters did their attack, in the sense that, he's leaving sort of a blueprint maybe for future attacks here. I don't know. That's what troubles me about zooming out from these two pictures, the long-term effects of perhaps this UnitedHealthcare killing. Like, is there some possibility that it will look like the long-term effects of Columbine?
Yeah, I think that I see what you're getting at. The idea that you're saying that Columbine, happened in 99, mm-hmm. and we still have people who idolize the Columbine shooters and want to duplicate what they think they did, because I think most people most people don't know the real facts in the Columbine case.
Sure.
But the theories that are out there in the glorified, romanticized images of who the Columbine shooters are and what they did and what they were trying to accomplish.
The mythos around it.
Yeah, it's very
for a
silly.
Certain kind of person.
Yeah, we've done a tremendous disservice over the years as we continue. I have a whole bunch of issues with Columbine in how it's covered, mm-hmm. and how it's talked about. But there's no question that there's a segment of the population that, and not just in the United States, but worldwide,
there's been dozens of shooters have referenced the Columbine shooters
oversee other countries, right?
Yeah,
and they make references to the Columbine shooters, and like I said, even though they're working with the wrong facts and the wrong information, it doesn't matter, because they're working with a romanticized version of it. But the difference between a second shooter that we're talking about, the individual who shot the CEO from the healthcare company. Both of them, and I never use the word manifesto unless it's like the Unabomber, because I think manifesto is a political statement. And I think sometimes people who deliver writings, we see writings that are delivered or left behind. Sometimes they're just rants about kind of everything in the world.
Most of the time, right? A lot of them are like that.
What's wrong? And then sometimes they're very specific. The Unabomber had very specific things, and it really was kind of a manifesto. And sometimes the shooter, you do see people who commit violent acts, and they do give something. They've got a very specific kind of political agenda or, social agenda that they want to translate and tell the whole world about. And I get that. A lot of times, like I said, we see a page or two of somebody. And also, I'll say this about Columbine killers. The copycat aspect. Sometimes somebody will leave behind on purpose a 5, 6, 7 page document, but that document is actually cut and pasted from other people's writings. We've seen that a lot. But
the Buffalo shooter did that.
Exactly, right. The Buffalo shooter did that, right? So, but all of that aside, I think your point is, I think your comment was about, the CEO shooter being like the first one of, and just like the Columbine shooters were the first ones of. And sometimes I think no, sometimes I think yes, but the no's come from the idea that targeted violence isn't new, and assassinations aren't new,
right?
And the idea that somebody's going to, with this assassination, it was clearly a political intent over a social issue. That he wanted to make that statement, and he wanted those. That's why he had those pages of writings that said, "Here's my issue with the healthcare industry." And I wonder, and I kind of question, which is all I'm doing, really questioning aloud, whether or not others will choose to do that to take out congressmen, to take out company, presidents, to take out, because that, like you said, that CEO didn't do anything to this guy. His company didn't do anything to this guy. He just took somebody out for the sake of, the action
sending
of
a message,
sending a message, right? And whether that's, religious leaders or political leaders or other social leaders, we haven't seen that, even though that's
right.
So maybe that's wishful thinking.
We can't know.
Right? Maybe that's wishful thinking.
It's only been 2 weeks or whatever.
Right. But that we're not going to, it doesn't mean that, but I think that, to your point, very much, there's always, every time something happens and there's a lot of news coverage on it, people get inspired. And
and it's not even just news coverage, right? It's like the broader media space. It's people focus on the news coverage aspect, and that's fair, right?
No,
how do we cover these things? There are probably more responsible ways of doing it than.
But it's you're right. I mean, I agree with you that it's the social media commentary that's more significant. I mean, I've heard from people. We've all seen comments on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on threads, on you fill in the blank about how, too bad he this happened to him, and they're in this sarcasm, right? It's sarcasm. And in the, social media allows us to be very cold and without a maybe appreciation that those comments don't go away. And they don't communicate. They just communicate hatred and sarcasm and anger, But I want it to not be. I want it to not be a trend, but I think it's smart that you can see that it could be. But
I hope it's not a trend too. But here's the thing, like that I guess what I see in it is like Columbine was not the first school shooting. It wasn't even the first school shooting that year, right? But it was something different about it, and it happened at a specific moment in time. The one thing that was different about it is they intended to send a bunch of messages to people to try and inspire other people to do similar acts. Right. They did this. They did a whole script making process. They planned out a whole playbook of how
they
people
spent
should do these things.
They spent months and months, particularly one of them, months and months and months and months. There was the planning was like the event was nothing compared to the planning.
And so, that was part of it. They wanted other people to see what they did and recreate it in some way or be inspired by it. And then on the other hand, too, is that it happened at a specific time in media, right? Like it happened at the forefront of the new age of cable news, 24-hour news, and the internet. So where, officials might have been able to, their writings might not have spread as far in a previous generation.
Yeah, there's no ability at that point forward to control information. I think there was a time period, though, for maybe 10 years where people thought they could control it. I remember having conversations with police chiefs, who would say, well, we're only going to release this or we're going to release that. And I said, no, that cat's out of the bag. You're not in control of information anymore. Look at the writings of this Madison, Wisconsin shooter, this piece of writing that may or may not be hers because it hasn't been validated by the police, but everybody's already done the analysis on it. Everybody's already read it, because it was released by somebody else. Yeah.
And that's the thing too, that I see with this, another similarity between what the Columbine killers did and what the UnitedHealthcare CEO killer did, is that he's sending messages and he's doing it in a way that is much more savvy to how our media atmosphere works today.
Agree.
He didn't send letters to a newspaper or whatever.
Agree.
He did something in front of cameras in a spectacular way that it looks like it's out of a movie, right? Probably because it is inspired by, movies in similar way that a lot of this stuff is inspired not just by copycatting from news reports, but sort of copycatting the idea that we all have of what a school shooter is or what a assassin is. Like an assassin is somebody who has a silencer on their gun when they go to murder somebody, even if it doesn't make sense in real life to how he carried it out. Like, I think that's more a part of him emulating what we expect an assassin to do.
I think targeted violence is
tactical.
Yeah. I mean, targeted violence is definitely, sorry, I'm talking over you. Targeted violence is definitely a situation where the person planning it comes up with all kinds of plans, and they overplan because they want to be in charge of the situation. And they plan and plan and plan and plan. And they want to add these extra things that are kind of cool because they have time to think about it.
Right.
I'm going to get this black shirt and it's going to symbolize this. And I'm going to get this hoodie because it's going to symbolize that. Exactly. And I'm going to put this belt on because it's going to, and I'm going to put this band on. I'm going to write these
messages on the casings.
Right.
I'm going to have Monopoly money in the backpack that I leave behind.
Exactly.
He's doing all these things to create an image of what he's trying to accomplish with this. Right. And it's the thing is that it is getting that level of notoriety that the Columbine killers were able to achieve.
Yeah.
And that's what makes me wonder, really, in the end, whether or not this is something that sticks. And the other half of it is that, before the Columbine killing, there were dejected kids who felt like outcasts and wanted to lash out. After the Columbine killing, a lot of those kind of kids looked at they would sympathize with what the Columbine killers did. They would see themselves in that. Now, but it's a very small group, right? Most people don't feel connection to school shooters or mass shooters. Whereas this situation, a lot more people seem to feel a connection to what motivated this shooter, even if they may not, agree with going out and killing somebody in cold blood as a response to how they feel. They definitely feel a connection with them, and you kind of wonder. And I think it's a lot more people than have ever felt a connection
I think
towards the Columbine kids.
One thing about the United Health guy, and one thing about the United Health guy is, his company impacts 1 in 4 people in the United States. 7,000
a lot of people don't
hospitals.
like the healthcare system, for sure.
Right. So if a lot of people don't like the healthcare system, there's a lot of potential angry people, and it makes it hard for law enforcement to even say who would have perpetrated this act. Right. When it's a school shooting, we know it's likely somebody from the school or who previously attended the school by a year or two.
And I think it extends to even beyond just anger at the healthcare system or health insurance to just anger at rich, powerful people generally in the system, right? The sort of like the Joker movie, that sort of anti-hero feeling that's out there, people just being angry at society and feeling, that it's treated them unfairly. There's a lot of that sentiment coalescing around what he did in killing the CEO, that makes you wonder if it's like something that people might take a lesson from it. Like, if you're feeling that, this is the problem with Columbine. Really unlocked a new. It's hard for me to describe this. It's called the Violence Project calls it social proofing. Like, it's not so much that society approves of school shooters and thinks that they do is right, but it thinks that this is how a certain kind of person may react to how they're feeling, if that makes sense. Yeah. And so that reinforces the idea that somebody who feels that way might think, oh, this is what I should do in this, because this is what society expects. And we have a school shooter trope stereotype, right? We know just inherently, we understand what you mean when you say that kid struck me as a school shooter. Right. And it's similar here in, like, if somebody is feeling, they see themselves in this killer and his actions and how he felt before he decided to do this. And society recognizes this as not necessarily an acceptable thing to do, but a thing that is something people do when they feel this way. You are more likely to see more people do that. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to get across with this?
Yeah, it does. And I think that something that maybe is, informative is that idea of, a couple of decades ago, we were saying someone would go postal.
Right.
And that what we meant by that was, shooting up their office. But when you look at targeted violence right now, and over the last 25 years, looking at targeted violent, when I say targeted violence, what I mean is not a bank robber who goes in to rob a bank and then he's committing a crime and then the security guard pulls a gun on him and the bank robber pulls his gun out and fires at him. Or two gangs who decide they're just going to fight each other and some of them have guns on them and they choose to pull guns out and start firing at each other. That's not targeted violence. That's violent, plain old violent crime that occurs at the moment. Bad
but different.
Bad but different in the heat of the moment. There's kind of two kinds of ways that you pull a trigger. One is anticipated, right, and one is unanticipated. And the anticipated one is planned violence, and that's what active shooters are: an individual who actively engages in shooting or attempting to kill people in a crowded space. That's what the FBI started researching because they're different than serial murders. They're different than gang murders. They're different than drug murders, and different than murders that occur incident to a criminal act where a gun is just pulled. So the idea of just looking at those targeted violent acts, you can have situations like this, like the CEO shooting. But if you date back to the days of going postal, what we meant by that, of course, was an employee who shot up his post office, and then people started to use that terminology. But in fact, when the Bureau started looking at active shooters over the last 25 years, of the data from the last 25 years shows us that almost half of all, or at least half of all targeted violence occurs in places of business. There is a reason why that fits. Schools are like 20% of these shootings, but places of business. So employees are angry and former employees are angry and customers are angry. And that's where most of this type of shooting occurs. So it's not surprising that somebody would lash out at a CEO in a targeted violence act because they do that. But I think the one difference for me is that in this one is that historically, right, 20 years or so of data, the shooter generally goes to the place they know to shoot the boss they know, to shoot the person who got their job or somebody who, took their desk. Right. And
this shooter didn't have UnitedHealthcare.
It's a difference.
He wasn't affected by this particular company.
Yeah, it's definitely a political position. Right? It's a political stance. I'm going to do this. When there was an assassination attempt on the former president, the future president, even to date, right, it's kind of murky as to why he bothered to do that, other than that he just wanted to become famous, right?
Right, and we still don't have a lot of his motivation.
And because sometimes people choose to lash out and do something because they're angry, and they're just internally in turmoil, and so they might go to some place. Just as a random, but I'll say this, they might end up shooting someplace where, 8 of the 10 victims are Black or Hispanic or Jewish, but it might not have anything to do with that particular subset of society. It might just be that that's where they happen to pull the trigger because that was close to their house or on the way to work, or because the people in their office, were that. But this type of assassination attempt, or a true assassination, as we saw, we call it an assassination because it was an execution, right? But he also didn't shoot and try to shoot other people around it. And I think that's different. But again, like you're saying, he's doing it out of a political stance, right? Political, socioeconomic policy, whatever his issues are, he made it clear. And I think that he does potentially open the door to other people who want to say, oh, I did it just like him. And that makes us look for, as investigators, that makes us look for the next person, put on your list of behaviors of concern, building, 3D guns, building 3D suppressors, buying the T-shirts that are from that band in Germany, the band who's disavowed and said they have nothing to do with it, but now people
from the
idolize.
Columbine shooting.
Right, exactly. And so that's what this shooter up in Madison happened to have that T-shirt on when she was at the range shooting, trap or trap or clay, whatever she was shooting with her dad.
Yeah.
But she clearly was manifesting some things that say somebody didn't see ahead of time.
Right. You brought up the going postal thing. And that's interesting to me for a couple of reasons, because one, and this gets back to what I'm talking about. Like, we focus a lot on news coverage of these events and maybe how, we shouldn't name the names of the shooters if they're fame seeking, which, we try to abide. I think it's a very small effect, frankly, but we do try to keep to that, here. We talk a lot about news coverage of this stuff when really the effect is much broader. And one example of that from going postal is like, one, that's a term everybody knows. And then I think it's kind of lost some of its meaning. People don't really, if you're under a certain age, you don't really understand what that's referring to necessarily. And it's kind of become a more generic term at this point, to the level that in where my mom's farm is, there's a like postal store, which is named Going Postal, which is kind of dark if you think about the origin of this term, because that was about people who, there was a period where postal employees, there was a stretch of shootings where they would kill a bunch of people in a post office, and it became sort of a rash of these attacks. But the other half of that, I think that sort of the use of going postal to even be an innocuous term today is kind of gets at the point I'm trying to make with like media, like our societal impression of these kinds of attacks, not necessarily being good, but being a thing that people do. And that reinforces for certain people that this is a thing I can do. And then beyond that, we did see that trend come to an end, right? We don't have the same level of postal employees, shooting up their coworkers or what have you.
No, I think that's true.
So it kind of now it's transitioned into a different sort of problem, the Columbine school shooting, mass shooting epidemic that we've seen, or whatever you want to call it, like this trend that we've seen in the last couple of decades. And, I do sort of wonder if we aren't transitioning to a new, I think it's super early for this, but this year we've had fewer mass shootings by whatever count you want to look at. And we've had more of these high profile assassination attempts, both of the president, the former and future president, Donald Trump, and then this killing. Now, this very small number, I don't want to get too far into speculation on it, but I do wonder if like there's a potential for transitioning from one form of mass media violence to another here.
Well, actually, that's what I was going to say. I think one thing that I think it's valuable to recognize is that we have developed a desire to see coverage and read and hear about school shootings. And if there isn't school shootings to see and hear about, let's move on to whatever is the next hot thing. And I worry about that because the people who are idolizing the Columbine shooters, the Columbine shooters didn't have they didn't have the motivation and the desires and the problems that the people who idolize them think they had, right? Like this whole image of, oh, these are two shooters who they were isolated and they were bullied and they wanted to shoot the jocks because they were part of the trench coat mafia. And those of us who study these areas know all of that was wrong, but it became the story, the myth that existed. And also it became the myth in books and in movies and in television shows over and over and over again. And those are the erroneous facts are constantly repeated by very knowledgeable people who didn't have the opportunity like maybe that I had to go back to the source. Like, you spend a week in Colorado with Frank DeAngelis, who's the principal of the high school there when the shooting occurred, and spend time talking to the police who responded. And and you learn little bits and details and stuff about what they planned and what they wanted to do. And, like one of the shooters was at the prom a couple of days before the shooting. They were, but the idea that these people and they want to do this and they want to create that image and that they want that persona of whatever they think that those shooters were, they want to continue that. And I, like now I live in, Nebraska, or I live in Virginia, and I want to be like Mike. I want to do that. And I think that we may not have the same ability to do that with what like with what you're saying with the CEO shooter. Those are going to be looked at if somebody does something, commits a violent crime like that against an individual. I don't think that they'll be using the term assassination as much as I heard this time. I think it's just a killing, right? It's a killing, the company president of this packing facility or this hospital or this, lawyer's firm, and the anger that somebody has that they develop over that brings them to do that kind of shooting. One guy's mad at the healthcare industry, but then the next guy's mad at the politician, and the next guy's, if you think back to, the guy who came on in Virginia and tried to kill people at the baseball practice. And Steve Scalise was injured there, and his security detail was there. So, and that's the reason that they were able to take out the shooter. But there have been those kinds of attacks on individuals.
That's obviously there's assassination attempts on political leaders all the time. They usually don't get as far as the more recent ones. And that may be one of the things that sort of colors our view of it, maybe, which seems like there's some shift going on when maybe it's just kind of, you're looking at small numbers. Same thing with the potential decline in mass shootings. These are relatively speaking, they are rare events. And so it can be hard just because we had 7 this year that meet the violence. I think we've had 4 this year that meet the violence project criteria, which, and these criteria, and,
I think
we've talked about definitions before, but
I think that's something beneficial to talk about. And I apologize for talking over you. I think that's something that's beneficial to talk about, is that of the criteria that we use. And because, in the FBI, active shooters you don't have to have anybody die. Right. If you've got somebody coming in and shooting, they count that as an active shooter incident. But there are other research efforts that use 3 dead or 4 dead. And it just depends on what their data collection is, their methodology.
Or 4 shot for the,
exactly.
That's why you
or
get
4
numbers
shot,
all over the place.
Right. That's why the numbers are all really different. And it doesn't
they
really
all have
matter.
Their strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
Like the Violence Project, I think gets the incidents in there get the closest to what people think of as a mass shooting. But it is limited, like this school shooting in Wisconsin wouldn't count because only 2 people were killed during that. And so there's obviously limits either way. The Gun Violence Archive, they use 4 or more shot, and they don't do any sort of filtering for other kinds of gun violence like gang crime or what have you.
Yeah, and shot and not killed, right?
Right.
So others may say, so you have 2 people killed and 10 people injured. That doesn't fit into this, but it does.
Trying to like draw hard conclusions from these things, because it kind of depends on how you're even looking at it, whether or not there has been a drop. I think
all the data is hard though, because the data is so hard because you are talking about really small numbers. So statistically, according to the FBI data, the last 25 years, the last 2 years, active shooter incidents have gone down 2 years in a row. To me, that's significant, but it is, if 100 people in the last 5 years, 100 people have died from active shooter incidents every year. Actually, it's 90. 90 people have died from active shooter incidents every year. That's 90 people who died from by gunfire out of 45,000 in the United States. So you're really talking about such a small amount of coverage, a small amount of the type of gun violence that occurs. And I think that one of the reasons why maybe in some cases the shootings are going down is I think we're doing a better job of finding shooters ahead of time. And there are a lot of states that have passed, red flag laws, and those are preventing shootings from happening just before they're going to shoot. Right. And look what happened in the case of the Madison, Wisconsin shooter was texting with a 20-year-old in California who was planning on trying to shoot up someplace. Maybe it was aspirational. Right. but police were concerned enough about it to go in and issue a red flag and order and take the individual's guns away.
Right. So, and then I would say too, like you can look at the postal shootings as another potential framework for how we might address these kinds of school and mass shootings down the line. Because, the post office actually themselves tried to undertake a program to prevent these, and it seems to have worked, right? They have like warning signs that people are supposed to report. And then they have, I think, even mental health help for somebody in that sort of situation. So, it's sort of something that worked, apparently, not 100%, but we don't have the same level of issue there. And maybe, taking those broader, or applying those lessons to a broader approach could be helpful as well. Right.
Yeah. I feel like I think we maybe agree on this. I feel like we're kind of entering a little bit of a new phase. Now the internet has kind of settled down. People understand, and I say the internet in a broad way, but I mean all of social media. And, we all know now that there's a ton of social media, and there always will be. And there's a ton of stuff you can access through the internet, so that some guy in Germany can talk to somebody in France who can talk to somebody in California who's on the same channel talking to somebody in Madison, Wisconsin. So there's a lot of room for people to be inspired without anybody knowing it, right. Until they actually strike. And then people say, oh, he was such a nice guy. And I never thought about him doing that. Right. But there's a whole online, just like in your neighborhood, when the gang, when there's a gang there and the gang wants everybody to join, and you see them all the time, or you feel like you need to belong to somewhere, you can always find your gang online.
Right.
But
which is a hard thing. That's a harder thing to interdict, right? To get in and
absolutely
try and, intervene with somebody before they carry out an attack, when they're in these more isolated online communities.
But I think
their loved ones don't even know.
I think though that when we talk about interdiction, the idea that you are going to try to find somebody online who's communicating might be difficult. But the thing is that in a targeted violent act, it is planned, and they often generally write out their plan, draw out
too,
their
right?
Drawings.
They call it leakage, right?
They tell other people. Do you know that in school shootings, FBI research shows that when they researched the largest group of school shooters that was ever researched was the FBI's behavioral experts, and when they researched leakage, they found 92% of the students leaked the intent to commit the violent act to another fellow student. 92%. So there's leakage, but also there are things like if they're going to commit suicide, they have a tendency to stop taking their medications, to give their things away. They all change their physical appearance. It all requires a certain jacket, T-shirt, right? So people around them, family, friends, peers, and teachers, for people who are students, but for business people, right? More than half of them, coworkers, bosses, the visible signs are there. The planning and the preparation is there. They do surveillance on their locations. They ask questions. So how many people I see, internal data. I feel like every week I see, intel bulletins from places, and they're saying, so we stopped this guy and he was asking, the security guard at the front, how many security people do you have working here? Who runs the cameras? What time does the place open? And they're doing their surveillance, asking questions. So
and
when
it
you
seems
hear
like
that,
this
you got to
CEO
report
shooter
it.
did the same thing in that he was planning this out for a while in advance.
Yes. I'm sorry, which one?
The CEO.
Oh,
killer.
yeah. Oh, for sure. He had it all planned out because he took the time to do it. He came in, he came in 10 days, they believe, before the shooting. He came into New York City. Well, that's to do reconnaissance. That's to walk by, see if he knows where he's going, to make sure that he has all the supplies and the equipment that he needs, that he figures out how to get a bike and how to do a getaway and what's the next the plane ticket that he needs or the train ticket that he needs. Mm-hmm. According to the surveillance video footage that was followed afterwards, he went right from the site down to get a bike took the bike that was prearranged, took the bike through the park, dropped the backpack, ended up going to the bus station, and took a bus, just like that. He had a plan, but that for a guy who they believe had not been to New York City before, he had to figure that out. All that pre-planning. But, how do you know somebody's buying a plane ticket or a train ticket, and they're paying cash? So what, right? But cash is an indicator. Paying cash for tickets is an indicator. I know that from my work on counterintelligence after 9/11, counterterrorism after 9/11.
But that's where it becomes hard, right? Because not everybody 3D printing a gun or paying with cash is going to be a murder.
Exactly.
Obviously.
And I think what we're looking for is behavioral changes in that individual and in more than one, right? You shoot a gun all the time and you decide you're going to go shoot, every week. Maybe that's because you're going to be in some competition. Maybe that's because you're getting ready for hunting season. But that's enough to be concerned that you're shooting more, or you buy a lot more ammunition, or you shave your head. In combination
with other.
You give your computer
factors,
away. Right. You stop taking your medication. Your grades drop. FBI behavioral experts say that grades will drop and communication capabilities will degrade long before you show any anger. That's what the research shows. So, if your work product it drops, and and you're late for work and you're not doing your work, or you're not doing your schoolwork,
cut off contact with
cut off contact with you. Those are all things that together, just like you think of like for suicide, right? Somebody who might be dealing with the suicidal tendencies. It's kind of the same things. People who isolate themselves and if we see those behavioral cues, then it isn't just about somebody who's, shooting at the range. Shooting at the range, and a picture of somebody shooting at the range isn't significant. But when you add to it a T-shirt, that's the same with the same band from Columbine High School, shooter.
Yeah.
So that's the hard part.
Then it becomes more concerning, right? Yeah, you have to recognize these things together. And it is hard, I think, for people who are very close to someone. It's very difficult to imagine that your loved one is somebody who may be going down this spiral. But in the end here, I think we perhaps agree that there's the potential that this UnitedHealthcare CEO shooting could draw copycats in the similar way that Columbine has. But also that perhaps some of the same strategies used to counter school shootings or mass shootings could be used to counter, people who are considering carrying out targeted killings like this one, right?
Yeah, I think what was unnerving, I completely agree with you on that. I agree with you 100% on what you just said. And I think in addition to that, the part that's unnerving for corporate America, for business, the world of business is the vulnerability. Absolutely. A lot of CEOs have security. I talked to somebody who works with a healthcare company after the shooting and said our entire corporate block is basically bunkered down, and all travel has been canceled. We don't want to have any risk of any copycats or anybody doing something this next week. And we do know that copycat shootings and targeted violence occur in the following, 10 to 14 days generally.
Yeah, clustering.
They cluster together, right? So it's possible, but somebody who's at the, big corporation, they may have, security around them, and they're coming through the back door, and they're traveling with security that's taking care of them, like the security executive protection, for the president of the United States and for people like that. But there's a whole host of other people who can't afford that type of security as part of their business plan, right? And they're running the small car dealership who, won't refund somebody money on a lemon car. And I think those are kind of things that if we, over time, will be able to tie together what appears to be targeted violence, especially if there's statements left behind, or there's the pattern once we look at it ahead of time about what prompted this person to get to that point. And then I think we'll be able to, next year will we be able to tie those together? Maybe not. But, in a couple of years, we'll be able to see whether or not, what you're predicting is that pattern is out there. I agree with you. Yeah.
But there is some hope that we can counter these things with the strategies that you discussed, right?
I'm telling you, not everybody buys it, but I see the changes. I see the changes in the number of people who are preventing shootings just because they know what to look for. I think, we had a podcast in our last, when the 5th season of Stop the Killing. Last season, we spent time with a vice principal of a school who came to us to say, hey, we listen to your podcast all the time and we found these circumstances and we stopped a school shooting at our school because of that. And I think that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago or 20 years ago because nobody kind of knew what those things were. And we're just sharing information that, I don't want to say everybody knows, but we're sharing common information, right? We just tie it together in a fun package because Sarah Ferris is so fun. My co-podcaster.
Well, speaking of your podcast, I really appreciate you coming on our show.
Yeah.
But why don't you tell people a little bit more about where they can find your writings and your podcast?
Oh, thank you. My everything ties back to KatherineSchweit.com. So if you can figure out how to spell my name, which is complicated, it's old-fashioned name. So KatherineSchweit.com. KatherineSchweit.com. You can find the books, Stop the Killing, How to End the Mass Shooting Crisis, and what I call my gun book, which is actually, we're going to rebrand it this week. You're getting like the news. This week, we're rebranding it to A Simple Guide to the Second Amendment, because that's really what it is. And then our podcast is on its 5th season. It's called Stop the Killing. And it's not, and I will say this about the books and the podcast, there's no politics in it. Death and killings are not a political statement for me. All my time in the FBI, you do your job and you follow the law, and politics aside, because nobody wants people to be killed, with guns in the United States. And so there's no politics discussions or arguments in the book either way. It's not a gun versus no gun. It's a much more engaging discussion about it, facts and figures and information that helps you to draw your own conclusions and also to help other people decide what they can do to stop the killing. So the podcast itself is, as I said, in its 5th season and available, at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you can find your podcast, your favorite podcast. We encourage you to subscribe, and we send to subscribers. We send out news hits in addition to that when something's happening with facts, right? Because a lot of times you hear stuff in the news, you don't really know what the facts are. We'll pop out something, that's 10 minutes that gives you the real details that are up to date. And you don't have to go find the rumors or sort through 1,000 news stories.
All right. Well, I recommend it. I think it's a great podcast, and I appreciate you coming on the show, and we'll have to have you on again in the future as well. Maybe
for something fun. Maybe we could just talk about like our favorite wines or something like that.
Yeah, that would be great.
Great. It was great to talk to you. Thanks for making the time.
Absolutely. All right. That's all we've got for you guys this week. We will see you guys again real soon.